It is 1942. The world is on fire. In New York City, the blackout curtains are drawn tight, but the fear cannot be contained. It leaks in under the doorsills, a cold draft smelling of the river and rationing. Men vanish. They are consumed by the yawning hunger of the draft, their names added to casualty lists from places no one can find on a map. They are swallowed by the shipyards, by the cold machinery of the war effort. But this disappearance is different. This silence is a tear in the fabric of power. In a fortress of red brick and heavy lace in Little Italy, a meal of osso buco, rich with marrow and wine, grows cold. The porcelain plate is a pale, accusing moon. The chair is empty. Don Vito Gallo, a man whose silence can halt a freighter, whose nod can fill a warehouse, stares at that chair. He stares at it with the burning, impotent rage of a king whose favorite son has vanished from a locked room. Angelo is gone, and in the coded world of La Cosa Nostra, a world built on blood, loyalty, and the absolute power of presence, gone is a word that echoes with the finality of a spade striking earth. Before we descend into the shadows of the Gallo family, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city, which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. The silence in the Gallo dining room was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a thick, suffocating thing, heavier than the oppressive humidity of the New York summer. It pressed down on the crystal chandelier, dulling its light. It clung to the thick velvet curtains, which were drawn against a city that no longer felt like their own. Maria Gallo, the Don's wife, sat at the far end of the long, polished mahogany table. She was a statue of maternal grief, her hands knotted in her lap, her knuckles white. She had not eaten. She had not spoken. Her gaze was fixed on the silver crucifix that hung on the wall, as if staring at it long enough could reverse the flow of time, could bring her boy back to the table. Her other sons, Leo, the eldest, the bull, his frame thick with muscle and impatience, and Salvatore, the middle, the fox, his eyes missing nothing, they ate. But it was a pantomime of nourishment. The scrape of their silver forks on the heavy china was an obscenity, a violence against the heavy quiet. Leo, feeling his mother's misery as an accusation, shot a look at his own children at the far end of the table. They had been whispering. They fell silent, their small faces pale. Don Vito Gallo, capo di tutti capi, finally placed his heavy silver fork and knife beside his untouched veal. He did not drop them. He did not slam them. He placed them with the deliberate, terrible precision of a watchmaker setting the final gear. The soft click of silver on porcelain was a gavel strike, a judgment. "He is 2 hours late," Vito said. The words were flat, cold stones dropped into a well. It was not a question. It was a statement of a fundamental crack in the world's foundation. Angelo, the baby, the golden one, the son scrubbed clean of the family's sins, was never late. Leo, swallowing his food with a visible effort, wiped his mouth. The heavy linen napkin was a shield, hiding the sneer that was his first response to any disruption. "He's 20, Papa," Leo said, his voice too loud for the room. "He's at Columbia. He's probably found some uptown girl, some blonde putana who doesn't know when to send a man home. He's forgotten the time." The dismissal was too quick, the contempt too practiced. It was the jealousy of the fist for the brain, of the man who does the dirty work for the man who is kept clean. Vito's eyes, dark and heavy-lidded, two pits of obsidian, didn't move from the empty chair. Angelo was not Leo. Angelo was the family's penance, their investment in legitimacy. He was the one who read books Vito didn't understand, the one who spoke an unaccented, educated English that sounded both foreign and beautiful. Angelo was the future, the respectable face that would one day sit on boards, not in back rooms. "No," Vito said. The word was absolute, a door slamming shut. He would have telephoned, the house telephone. He knows his mother worries. The implication hung in the air, thick and rancid as cigar smoke. If he could have telephoned, he would have. Maria's hand flew to the gold crucifix at her throat, her thumb rubbing the worn, smooth body of the Savior. A sound, a tiny, trapped gasp escaped her. It was the only sound she had made. Vito turned his gaze, heavy as a shroud, to Leo. The order was not spoken. It did not need to be. Find him. Leo pushed his chair back, the legs screaming in protest against the polished floor. The sound was a desecration. "Si, Papa." He was already in motion, his mind a brutal ledger. The docks, the social clubs, the jazz bars in the village where Angelo sometimes went, slumming it, listening to that damnable swing music. He would take his crew, he would squeeze the city, shake it by its ankles until his brother, his soft, stupid brother, fell out. But as he reached the door, Salvatore, the quiet one, the consigliere in training, spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, like sand. "Leo, do not make noise. The war. The G-men are everywhere. They watch the docks for sabotage. They watch us. Be a whisper, not a storm." Leo grunted, a sound of pure animal frustration. Noise was all he knew. Noise was his gift. In the dining room, Vito Gallo stared at the empty plate. The rich osso buco was congealing, the marrow turning a sickly, pale yellow. He thought of his shipping contracts, his monopoly on the black market sugar, the gasoline siphoned for his trucks, the cooperation with naval intelligence to keep the docks safe. He had built an empire on the world's chaos, a fortress for his family. And now the chaos had crept inside, had walked past his guards, and had stolen the only thing he had ever tried to keep pure. The silence returned, heavier this time, smelling of cold gravy and a new, unfamiliar fear. This was not a matter for the police. The Gallos did not speak to police, who were merely the city's other, less organized mafia, a rabble of uniformed thieves on a municipal payroll. To involve the authorities was to confess impotence, to announce to the world that your own power had failed, that your fences were broken. It was an open invitation to the wolves, to the Tartaglias, the Barzinis, to every hungry predator circling his territory. Don Vito's order had been simple, absolute. Find Angelo, and find who had the audacity, the sheer stupidity to take him. Leo Gallo, released from the oppressive silence of the dinner table, attacked the task with the religious fervor of an inquisitor. By midnight, less than 2 hours after Vito had laid down his fork, a dozen of the family's most trusted men who specialized in making problems and people disappear, were moving through the city. They moved like wraiths in heavy wool coats and fedoras, their presence a sudden cold draft in the smoky back rooms of Mulberry Street social clubs, a sudden fearful silence in the longshoremen's bars by the frozen river. They did not ask questions so much as demand answers, their voices low, their hands heavy. A barman at a small bistro near Columbia, a place Angelo was known to frequent, was slapped hard enough to rattle his teeth loose, the impact echoing in the small space. He suddenly, miraculously, remembered Angelo hadn't been in for a week. A tailor, who owed the Gallo family a significant gambling debt, was lifted 6 inches off the floor by his lapels. He wept, swearing on the soul of his sainted mother he hadn't seen the boy. Fear was the Gallos' primary currency, the coin they used to buy silence, loyalty, and information. But this time, the currency was failing. The usual informants, the dock workers, the numbers runners, the street corner prophets, the padrone who controlled the Italian laborers, they were all genuinely, visibly ignorant. Their fear of Leo Gallo was immense, but their ignorance was absolute. It was as if Angelo Gallo had simply dissolved, evaporated into the coal smoke and wartime fog of the city, a ghost before he was even dead. Leo grew more frustrated, his methods cruder. The whisper Sal had advised became a roar. He dragged a low-level bookie into a pitch-black alley, the air thick with the smell of urine and rot. He pressed the barrel of a .38, cold and oily, against the man's temple, demanding a name, any name. The man just wept, a high-pitched animal sound swearing he knew nothing. Leo's rage was a hot, sour thing in his throat. He had always seen his younger brother as weak, soft, a liability. This was the price of that softness. But he was Gallo blood. An insult to Angelo was a mortal insult to the Don, and Leo was above all a loyal son. He would tear down the city brick by brick to find the man who had laid hands on his brother. Back in the brick fortress, Don Vito sat in his study. The room was his sanctuary, his chapel, paneled in dark wood, smelling of his expensive, pungent cigars and old leather. He was on the heavy black rotary telephone, his voice a low, polite rumble. He spoke in Sicilian, a language of veils and shadows, a language for secrets. He was calling in markers, speaking to the capos of the other families, extending requests that were, in fact, demands. Had they heard anything? Had one of their rogue soldiers, drunk on whiskey and ambition, overstepped? The answers were all the same: respectful, almost loving condolences, feigned shock, and utter impenetrable plausible denial. Vito, on my children's eyes, no one has touched the boy. To do so would be suicide. It would be a sacrilege, especially now, with the war making business so profitable for us all. Vito hung up the heavy receiver, the clack of it settling into its cradle sounding final. If it wasn't his rivals, and he believed them, for to lie about this would be to invite a war no one wanted, then who? He looked at the framed photograph on his desk. Angelo, age 12, in his immaculate white First Communion suit. His face was bright, angelic, uncorrupted. A face that did not belong in this room, in this life. Vito Gallo felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter draft leaking through the window frames. It was the primal, sickening fear that the enemy wasn't outside the walls, that the rot, the betrayal, had started from within. On the third day, the city was a raw nerve. Leo Gallo, his eyes swollen and bloodshot from lack of sleep and too much whiskey, took a crowbar to the lock on his brother's apartment. He no longer cared about whispers. He kicked the door open. The apartment was on a quiet, tree-lined street near the university, a place paid for by his father to keep Angelo physically and spiritually separate from the business. The apartment was an immediate insult to Leo. It was quiet. It didn't smell of his mother's garlic and tomato sauce or his father's cigars. It smelled of paper, floor wax, and soap. It smelled clean. And there were books everywhere. Not ledgers, not account books, but books with soft, worn covers, their pages filled with poetry. Leo picked one up, his thick fingers clumsy. Keats, Shelley. He didn't know the names, but he knew the type. He threw the book against the wall, his contempt a physical force. This was the weakness his father had paid for. This was what made Angelo soft, what made him vulnerable. This was what got him taken. He and his men tore the place apart with a savage efficiency. They were not looking for clues. They were committing an act of violation. They ripped open the mattress, feathers and stuffing exploding into the quiet room. They emptied the closets, Angelo's neat, pressed suits and shirts thrown to the floor. They pulled up the floorboards in the small kitchen. Nothing, no letters, no strange numbers, no sign of a struggle, which was itself a terrifying sign. Then Sal the Ledger Petrucci, the family consigliere who had come to oversee the search and mitigate Leo's damage, found it. He had been methodical, checking the places Leo's rage had ignored. Tucked in the back of the closet, beneath a stack of clean folded shirts, was a worn leather satchel. It was not Angelo's usual briefcase. Sal placed it on the bare mattress. Inside there was no sign of a ransom note, no threat from a rival. There was only a change of clothes, not a tailored wool suit, but a pair of workers' denim trousers and a rough wool shirt, the kind the longshoremen wore. Beside it was a thick envelope containing $500 in small bills, a staggering amount of cash for a young man to have loose. And beneath that a train schedule for Pennsylvania Station, a one-way ticket to Chicago, dated for the day he disappeared. Sal, his face as impassive as a death mask, held up the schedule between two fingers. Leo. Leo stalked over, his face darkening from red rage to a pale, sick white as he understood. He snatched the satchel, his knuckles white. This changed everything. This wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't a rival family making a move. This was betrayal. This was desertion. Angelo wasn't taken. He was running. To Leo, this was a sin worse than death. To be kidnapped was to be a victim, a casualty of their life. To run, to abandon the family, to steal away like a common thief with a pocketful of family money, it was the ultimate act of disrespect. It was a rejection of Papa, of the blood, of the very code of silence and loyalty that gave them life. Don Vito Gallo received the news in his study. Sal, not Leo, presented the evidence. He laid it out on the polished desk. The bag, the workers' clothes, the cash, the train schedule. He was a doctor presenting a terminal diagnosis. He watched the Don's face, looking for the expected explosion, the shattering of glass, the roar of Sicilian rage. But Vito Gallo did not explode. He simply sat, his hands steepled, his eyes fixed on the train schedule, as if it were a declaration of war from a foreign power. The silence in the room became suffocating, a vacuum. He saw it now. not as an insult, but as a symptom of a disease he had allowed to fester. He had tried to raise an American prince, a scholar, and had instead raised a traitor, or worse, a coward. "Find out why," Vito whispered, the command more terrifying than any shout. Find out who he was running to, and find out who stopped him. The implication was clear. If he ran, he was a traitor. If he was stopped while running, he was a fool, and whoever stopped him had broken a different, but equally fatal rule. While Leo tore through the city's underbelly, his rage now poisoned with the knowledge of his brother's betrayal, Maria Gallo sought answers in the one place her husband's power could not or would not reach. She dressed in her finest black, a heavy silk dress, and a veil so thick it rendered her anonymous, a spectre of grief. She did not go to their grand parish church, St. Patrick's, where the bishop knew her husband by name, and the collection plates overflowed with Gallo money. Instead, she had her driver take her to a small crumbling chapel in a poorer neighborhood, St. Michael's. The stone was soot-stained, the air heavy with the smell of poverty and cheap incense. This was where Angelo used to go. He said he liked the quiet, the simplicity. Maria knew he went to see the priest there, a young, earnest man named Father Michael. She suspected he went there to confess the sins of his father. Maria entered the church, the cold of the stone pews seeping into her. The smell of old incense and melting wax was a cold, alien comfort. She did not kneel. She did not pray. She went straight to the rectory door and knocked. Father Michael, thin and pale, his cassock worn, his eyes already haunted by the confessions of a wartime city, was visibly shaken to see her. "Signora Gallo, piacere. Please come in. This is an unexpected honor." He offered her a hard wooden chair, but she remained standing, a black marble statue of judgment. Her veil was still down. "You were my son's confessor, Padre." It was not a question. It was an accusation. "Angelo, he came to you. He spoke to you." Father Michael's hands, thin and chapped, trembled slightly. He touched the worn purple stole around his neck, a talisman against the power radiating from her. "Signora, you know I cannot. The seal of the confessional is absolute. It is a sacred trust between a soul and God." Maria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than any shout, a blade of cold steel. "I am not asking what he confessed. I am not God. I am his mother. I am asking you, as a man of God, was my son in trouble? Was he in fear? The church asks us to save souls, Father. Was his soul in danger?" The priest looked away, toward the small, grime-covered window that looked out onto a brick wall. The hypocrisy of the moment was a physical weight, suffocating him. She, the wife of a man who dealt in death and corruption, a woman draped in the profits of sin, was appealing to the sanctity of the church to find a son who was perhaps fleeing that very corruption. "Mrs. Gallo," the priest said, his voice strained, his own conscience a battlefield. "Angelo, he was a conflicted boy, a beautiful, conflicted soul. He loved his family, deeply. You must believe that. Love is not a conflict, Father, it is a duty." He was troubled, the priest stamed, pushing on. He was troubled by the state of the world, the war. He read the papers, he saw the lists of the dead, he saw the suffering. He felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply for this life. "What burden?" she hissed, the word a snake. "His name? The food he ate? The education his father paid for?" The priest flinched, but he held his ground. "The source of the money. He was ashamed. He felt the war was a terrible cleansing fire, and he was sitting on the sidelines safe, while other men his age were dying for their country. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to find a clean life." Maria's eyes, invisible behind the veil, hardened. "The right thing? The right thing is to honor your father, to be loyal to your blood, to protect your family. Everything else is a luxury, an indulgence." She could see the priest knew more. He knew about the plan to run. He knew the why. But he was trapped by his vows, a cage she found both convenient and pathetic. She saw the answer in his terrified, righteous eyes. Angelo's conscience was the enemy. You were the enemy, she thought. You poisoned him with this guilt. You were no help to him, she said, the words of final judgment a curse. You filled his head with guilt, but gave him no answers, no strength, only weakness. She turned and left the rectory, a swirl of black silk and expensive perfume, leaving Father Michael shaking, clutching his rosary. Maria Gallo walked back into the cold daylight. The church had failed her. It was a house of weak men and weaker rules. There was only one faith left, the family, and it too was cracking from the inside out. Business does not stop for grief. The war raged, and the New York docks were the throat of the Allied war effort, pumping men and material into the fight. For Don Vito Gallo, this meant his black market empire of stolen gasoline, lost sugar crates, diverted penicillin, and hijacked tire shipments was more profitable than ever. But the Don's distraction, his black mood, was becoming a liability. Sal, the ledger Petrucci, the consigliere, sat in the study, the account books open on the desk. He was the only one who dared speak to Vito like this, without the bowing and the honorifics. He was all business. "Vito," he said, his voice flat, "the Tattaglia family is moving on our territory by the Navy Yard. They've been talking to our union reps. They smell weakness. They think you are distracted. Your men on the docks are unfocused. They're scared, but not of us. They're scared of the silence from this house." He motioned to the book. "And Leo. Leo is a wrecking ball. He's not thinking, he's making noise, shaking down men who have nothing to do with this. He's drawing attention. The feds are watching the docks for saboteurs, and Leo is acting like a German U-boat. He needs to be pulled in." Vito stared out the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The formal garden his wife tended was dead, covered in a thin, dirty layer of city snow. "Let Tattaglia move. I will burn their houses to the ground with their children inside when this is done." Sal sighed, a sound of profound frustration. He was a man of logic, of numbers, and this emotional chaos was inefficient. "When what is done, Vito?" "We found the bag. The boy was leaving. He spat on you. He spat on all of us. He took your money. He rejected your name. Maybe he made it to Chicago. Maybe he's on a train to California. Maybe he fell in the river. He is gone. But we are here. The business is here. Your other sons are here. Your family is here, and it is bleeding." Vito turned slowly, his eyes two black holes in a gray, tired face. "He is my blood. He is my son. You think I build this thing for men like Tattaglia? I build it for him. For my legacy, for my family. And one son is missing." Sal stood up, closing the heavy ledger with a quiet thud. He had held back one piece of information. He had not given it to Leo, for Leo was a hammer, and this required a scalpel. Then what if he wasn't running from you, Vito? What if he was running with someone? Vito's stillness was absolute, the stillness of a predator. "What do you mean?" Angelo was soft, yes, but he wasn't stupid, and he wasn't a thief, not really. $500, a train ticket, a plan. This was organized, but he didn't go alone. He was meeting someone. A boy like that, a poet, he doesn't run for an idea. He runs for love. Sal's methodical, cold logic cut through Vito's fog of grief and rage. It was the first piece of sense he had heard in 3 days. "Angelo, the romantic, the fool. You did not let Leo search his apartment, Sal. You went," Vito stated. "You went after he was finished breaking the furniture. What else did you find? The item you did not show me." Sal paused. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small, simple object on the polished desk. It was a locket, not gold, silver and cheaply made. Inside was no miniature portrait, just a tiny pressed 4-leaf clover. "It was under his pillow," Sal said. "This is not the kind of gift one of our women gives. This is not gold. This is Irish." Vito Gallo's face contorted, a mask of pure cultural disgust. An Irish girl, a putana from the 5 Points or Hell's Kitchen, a barmaid. She had poisoned his son's mind, turned him against his own blood with cheap sentiment and foreign ideas. "Find her," Vito commanded, his voice now clear and cold as a razor. "Find this Irish whore. She will tell us where he went, or she will tell God why she was born." Leo Gallo had been spinning his wheels, his rage directionless, shaking down the same terrified bookies and informants. When Sal Petrucci, in his quiet, precise way, gave him the new lead, it was like a restorative, a shot of clean whiskey. This was a target, a tangible enemy, an Irish girl. It simplified the betrayal, gave it a face he could hate, a body he could break. It took Sal's men, who were listeners and watchers, not brawlers, less than a day to find her. Her name was Aoife O'Malley, a waitress in a diner near the university, a place that smelled of burnt coffee and cheap grease. She lived in a cold-water flat in Hell's Kitchen, a neighborhood of slaughterhouses, tenements, and Irish accents thick as wool. Leo didn't go himself. He sent his two best men, the ones who didn't need to use their guns to inspire a terror that could stop a man's heart. He sent Paulie and Rocco. They were inside her apartment, having picked the cheap lock, waiting in the dark when she came home from a double shift, her feet aching, the smell of the diner clinging to her thin coat. When she lit the gas lamp, the match trembling in her hand, her scream was cut short by Paulie's large, gloved hand clamping over her mouth. She was terrified, but she wasn't a fool. She saw the sharp suits, the quiet menace, the way they moved. They were his family. "Where is he?" Paulie asked. He didn't shout. He was calm, polite almost, which was worse. Aoife, trembling so hard she could barely stand, shook her head, her eyes wide over his hand. I don't know. He never came. He was supposed to meet me at the station. He never came." Rocco, the quieter of the two, stepped forward. He ran a gloved finger along a cheap framed picture of her parents, two stern-faced people staring out from a lost time. "Don't lie to us, Putana. We know you poisoned him. We know you filled his head with nonsense about running away, about a clean life." Where was he going? Aoife's fear was suddenly eclipsed by a flash of desperate, grieving anger. He wanted to leave. He was ashamed, she cried, the words muffled by Paulie's hand. He relaxed his grip, letting her speak. He was ashamed of the money, ashamed of the business. He said while other boys, good boys, are dying in the war, his family was getting rich off it. He called it blood money. He wanted to be a real American, not one of you. Paulie slapped her. The sound was flat and final in the small, damp room. It snapped her head back. "You will speak of the Don's family with respect." He leaned in, his voice a sibilant whisper, the smell of cloves on his breath. "He was running to you." "Where?" Aoife was crying now, hot, silent tears of terror and grief. "Chicago. We were going to Chicago. He was going to enlist. Under my name. O'Malley. He said he had to do one last thing before he met me at the station. One last person he had to talk to." Paulie's eyes narrowed to slits. "Who? Who did he go to see? The priest?" "No," she wailed. "He said, 'I have to tell my brother. I can't leave without him knowing why.' He said he had to. He had to tell Leo." The two men looked at each other. The air in the room, already cold, went arctic. They understood. Everything. Paulie nodded, a slight, almost respectful movement. "Thank you, miss. You've been a great help." He put his gloved hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was almost kind, and then, with a sharp, brutal efficiency, a sickening crack of bone and cartilage, he snapped her neck. She slumped to the floor, a pile of wet wool and broken dreams. Rocco placed the cheap silver locket on the table beside her. A message. The loose end was tied. The circle was closed. The study was dark. Don Vito Gallo sat behind his massive desk. The only light came from a single green-shaded banker's lamp, which cast his face in a sickly, pale shadow, highlighting the deep lines etched from his nose to his mouth. He had been sitting there for an hour, unmoving, a glass of untouched whiskey by his hand. The radio, playing softly, announced Allied gains in the Pacific, a world away. It was all static, meaningless noise. Sal Petrucci had delivered the news from Paulie and Rocco. He had delivered it with his usual lack of emotion, a simple reporting of facts, the girl's confession, the plan to enlist under a false Irish name, and the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. The last words she had heard from Angelo: "I have to tell my brother. I have to tell Leo." Vito had dismissed Sal with a wave of his hand. He had sat in the crushing silence, the words echoing, rearranging themselves, forming a new, monstrous truth. He had sent his eldest son, his bull, his most loyal soldier, to find his youngest son. And all the while the answer was sitting across from him at the dinner table, his fork scraping the plate, his face a mask of false concern. He finally buzzed the intercom on his desk. His voice was a dry rasp. "Send me Leo." A minute later, Leo entered, his massive frame filling the doorway. He looked exhausted, his suit rumpled, his tie loose. He was still playing the part of the grieving, frustrated brother, and playing it well. "Any news, Papa?" he asked, his voice rough with manufactured weariness. Vito didn't answer. He just stared at his son, his firstborn. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as wet cement. A clock ticked on the mantelpiece, each tick a hammer blow against the quiet. "You were busy tonight," Vito said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "The Irish girl, the putana." Leo stiffened, his performance faltered. "A loose end, Papa. Sal's men found her. She was filth. She turned him against us." "She turned him," Vito repeated. It was not a question. It was the turning of a key in a lock. "She made him ashamed of his name, ashamed of me." "Yes, Papa," Leo said, his voice brimming with a righteous anger that now sounded hollow, practiced, a lie told so many times it almost believed itself. "She told him we were leeches, that the business was dirty. She put that poison in his ear." Vito leaned forward into the small pool of green light. His eyes were dead, two burnt-out coals. "He was going to tell you, the night he disappeared. He came to tell you he was leaving, that he was going to enlist, to fight in the war. Like a man." Leo's composure finally shattered. The mask of the loyal son cracked. A muscle in his jaw twitched, a wild, uncontrollable spasm. "He was a fool," he exploded, the word a gunshot in the quiet room. "He was a coward. He was running away, spitting on our name. He was going to enlist, to fight for the government that wants to put us in prison, that hunts us. He was weak. He was always weak, Papa. You always protected him, but I saw it. He was rotten." The confession was there, in the rage, in the justification, in the jealousy that had festered for 20 years. Vito stood up slowly, his joints creaking. He was suddenly an old man. "What did you do, Leo?" Leo's face, which had been contorted with a lifetime of anger, suddenly crumpled. He looked for just a moment like a small, terrified 10-year-old boy. I just went to talk to him. He called me. He said he had to see me, down by the new warehouse. I tried to talk sense into him, Papa. I begged him. I told him he was breaking your heart, breaking Mama's heart. I told him he was disrespecting you." "And what did he say?" Vito whispered, the words barely audible. Leo was breathing heavily, his chest hitching, the memory replaying in his eyes, vivid and terrible. He said the heart was already broken. He said the family was a sickness. He said he'd rather die in a trench than live one more day on your money. He called you a traitor, a leech, profiting while real men died." Leo looked at his own massive hands as if he didn't recognize them. "He pushed me. He called me a killer, a dumb animal, your animal. I hit him, Papa. Just to shut him up. Just to stop the words. I just hit him." He was sobbing now, dry, racking sounds that tore from his throat. "But he was so soft. You made him soft. He fell. He just fell. He hit his head on the rebar sticking out of the new foundation." The image filled the room stark and cold. The new warehouse, the foundation, the wet concrete. He wasn't moving, Papa. His eyes were open. I didn't know what to do. He was gone. He was blood. It was a mistake, an accident. I fixed it. I had to fix it. I couldn't let anyone find him. I couldn't let them find Gallo blood in the dirt. I put him in. I fixed it. For the family. Don Vito Gallo did not rage. He did not weep. He did not move. The capacity for both had been hollowed out of him, leaving a vast, cold emptiness. He simply nodded, a slow, tired gesture of a man accepting a terrible mathematical proof. He understood. The code he lived by, the code of strength, of loyalty, of omerta, had demanded this. Angelo's weakness, his desire for a clean life, was a betrayal of the blood. Leo's violence, his brutal correction, was an act of loyalty. The system had worked perfectly. The machine he had built had run precisely as designed. It had eaten his son. "Leave me," Vito said. The words were quiet, a handful of dry dust. Leo, his face slick with tears and sweat, looked desperate. He was a dog, waiting for a pat on the head, for absolution, for forgiveness, for his father to say, "You did the right thing." But Vito just turned away, staring at the photograph of the boy in the white communion suit, his face bright and clean. Leo, the loyal son, the murderer, backed out of the room, closing the heavy door, leaving his father alone in the dark. That night, Don Vito Gallo did not sleep. He did not drink his whiskey. At 3 in the morning, he walked. He put on his heavy wool coat and his hat and walked out of the house alone. No bodyguards. He walked through the sleeping streets of his neighborhood, past the bakery that smelled of fresh bread, past the butcher shop, past the church, places where men bowed to him, where women curtsied, where he was a god, a protector. He walked all the way to the docks. The waterfront was quiet, save for the lapping of the oily black water against the piers and the distant metallic groan of a ship being loaded for the war. He stood before his new warehouse. It was a monolith of dark brick and fresh concrete, a monument to his power, built on his money, his connections, and his intimidation. It was the future of his empire. He stood there for a long time, the cold, wet air seeping into his bones, a coldness that felt like it was rising from the ground itself. He was standing on his son's grave. The foundation was vast, solid, and deep. A perfect, final silence, a perfect omerta. He had spent his life demanding respect, building a fortress to protect his family, only to realize he had built a tomb. The son he had tried to keep clean was now buried in the foundation of the very corruption he was fleeing. The son he had raised to be strong had become the murderer, the sexton. He looked out at the water, at the distant mocking green lights of the Statue of Liberty. He felt nothing, not grief, not rage, just the cold, profound, unyielding weight of the concrete beneath his feet. He walked back as the sun was rising, a dirty grey smear in the east. He was no longer a father. He was just a don, a title, an empty shell. When he returned to the house, Sal Petrucci was waiting on his stoop, a thermos of black coffee in hand. Sal had not slept. Sal had known. He had put the pieces together. He had known Leo was the last person to see him. He had known the girl's death was a clumsy, brutal cover-up. Sal just looked at his boss, his eyes full of a quiet, pragmatic pity. He handed Vito a small cup of the steaming coffee. "The Tartaglias are waiting for an answer, Vito," Sal said softly, his voice the sound of adding machines and ledgers. "They want a meeting about the Navy Yard, and the warehouse is ready to receive the sugar shipment from Havana." Vito Gallo took the offered cup. The coffee was bitter and scalding hot. It was the only thing he had felt in hours. He drank it down. "We will meet them," Vito said, his voice a dead, hollow monotone. "And we will double the sugar shipment. The war isn't over. There is work to be done." Months passed. Winter bled into a cold, wet spring. The war in Europe and the Pacific intensified, and the casualty lists in the newspapers grew longer, columns of forgotten names. The Gallo family business, however, boomed. The new warehouse on the docks, the one with the deep, solid foundation, became the beating heart of their black market empire. It was a fortress of stolen sugar, diverted penicillin, hijacked gasoline, and contraband liquor. Leo, now his father's undisputed right hand, his only heir, ran the cruise. But he was a changed man. The old boisterous anger was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow-eyed brutality. He was no longer just a bull, he was a butcher. His men, who had once treated him with a familiar, fearful respect, now looked at him with pure terror. He never spoke of Angelo. No one did. The name itself was a ghost, buried in concrete and silence, more terrifying in its absence than any living threat. Don Vito Gallo's power had never been greater. His enemies, the Tartaglias included, had smelled the new coldness emanating from the Gallo family and had retreated. His profits were staggering, and his political connections, greased by wartime urgency and immense payoffs, ran all the way to Albany and Washington. He had won. One Sunday, 6 months after the disappearance, the family gathered again in the great dining room. The scene was the same: the long mahogany table, the gleaming crystal, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the bright afternoon sun. Maria Gallo sat at one end, thinner now, a wraith in black silk. Her black dress was permanent, her piety a brittle, obsessive shield against a truth she dared not acknowledge. She spent her days in church, lighting candles for her lost son. Leo sat at his father's right, his wife and children beside him, all silent, their faces pale. Sal Petrucci was there, the quiet observer, the ledger watching. Don Vito Gallo sat at the head of the table. In front of him was a plate of osso buco, perfectly prepared, and beside him, to his left, the empty chair. It was still there. It was never moved. It was polished every morning by the housekeeping staff. It was a permanent fixture, a black hole at the center of their lives, a monument to the silence, a guest of honor. Vito raised his glass of dark red wine. The family, startled by the gesture, raised theirs. "To the family," Vito said, his voice like gravel. "To our future. Salute." They drank. The wine tasted like ash. As the meal began, the mechanical scrape of silver on porcelain filled the room. It was the only sound. The grandchildren, older now, understood. They did not whisper. Leo ate, his eyes on his plate, chewing with a methodical animal persistence. Maria stared at the empty chair, her food untouched, her hand gripping the crucifix at her throat. Don Vito Gallo methodically cut his meat. He had built an empire. He had enforced the code. He had protected his family. He had everything a man could want. He had power, wealth, and respect, and he had nothing. And he was the king of a rotten kingdom, a pharaoh in a tomb of his own making, presiding over a silent, endless feast, forever haunted, not by the ghost of his lost son, but by the cold, unbearable, and final presence of his survival.